Well, Lord, as we approach our national election, our hearts at turns have been anxious, deeply afraid, and joyful. We have felt the range of human emotions that comes when we engage in processes meant to change the world for the better, but which often are riddled through with the brokenness of humanity. So gird our loins and guard our hearts that we might be your people, not only in these days before the election, but after, that we may move past fear and joy, past longing and expectation into faithful service and action. So guard the vulnerable in our communities and make us courageous to do the work of serving those most in need. Be with us in this time as we continue to learn about your presence with us and your call to us in each and every new day. In Christ. Amen. Amen. And welcome to those of you who are joining us on YouTube, or excuse me, on our Zoom call. Today, our hope is to present to you something of a draft plan that comes from conversations with stewardship, with vestry, with parishioners who have been in these meetings and sessions, indeed hearkening even back to our listening process engaged over the summer with our consultants, the Vandersal Collective, and incorporating learnings from all of those things as we look at November 6th and every day after as we lead forward into a new year. So I'm using two computers because I don't know how to do present mode on a not Mac. But you will see that over the past 5 weeks, St. John's engaged in a process of thinking about, hoping for, and discerning how we intend to live faithfully, no matter the outcome of the after day one or on day one after the 2024 election. And to do this, we committed to begin with our values, with our core faith and what guides us as people thereof. It's important to name that in the early parts of this process, we actually explored all the possible outcomes that could happen on day one and thereafter. So that meant, for those of you who may not have been here, looking at the possibility of an election that seems inconclusive from the institutions we trust to call it, for a short while and for a long while, and perhaps indefinitely. We have talked about the possibility of violence following the election on both sides. We've seen violence pointed at the Republican nominee. We saw violence on January 6th pointed at the winner of the Democratic nominee in the last election. So we know that violence is possible on both ends of the spectrum. We also have looked at, as you'll see as we move into this, those who stand to be harmed, the most vulnerable. And we'll get to that in a moment, but keeping in mind both outcomes that are possible, or many outcomes that are possible in this election. What are our values? Well, obviously there are many, but if you were in the room for that session, what we articulated as our values were love, joy, hope, service, inclusion, care, welcome, justice, dignity, healing, the work of proclamation, and faithfulness. I'm sure you can think of others. This is not meant to be exhaustive, although with 12 picked, it's getting close to exhaustive. You know, we Episcopalians, we leave no words unspoken or unwritten. So the question then is, with these values and aware of the many kinds of outcomes that will come on November 6th and following, who will be impacted? In this room, we articulated groups we were most deeply concerned about, and they are printed there. But we also named the land, the water, and the air. We also named the plants and the animals, naming that there is something in the work we've been doing for racial reconciliation that brings us into an awareness of particularly indigenous understandings of land, water, air, plants, and animals, as all being a part of a community and being siblings to us and worthy of our care and compassion and worthy of their own dignity. But there were many groups and peoples named, including the military, who will be the first deployed into conflicts by our new president after they are elected. Conflicts that may be avoided or negotiated or spared, and that we worry about those who serve even there, our global allies, children, indigenous people, communities of color, immigrants, LGBT plus folks, the differently abled, women. And we thought even locally, who is our closest neighbor group that could be affected? Our Rondo neighbors. So then the question moved. We know what our values are. We know, at least theoretically, what are some possible outcomes. We know what we're carrying inside of us, some of the things that I prayed about in our opening. We also know that there are things that are going to hold us back from being faithful. We have to release things in order to move into action. And we cannot just stay where we are. And I had this professor in seminary who talked about life transition moments as being much like the people of Israel with the tabernacle and the tent of gathering as they moved in the wilderness, that sometimes they had to pull up the stakes and the tackle and the gear and take it with them. And sometimes they were being hasty and they had to cut the ropes and go. And so there's this sense of what you might have to leave behind in order to keep on the journey. I love that image. It stays with me. I don't know if it's 100% appropriate now, but there you are. What shall we release? So we named in this room, we recognized all these things, that a posture of care and readiness to serve our community. These are the things that we might need to release. Probably a lot more. Our desire to be right or to win. Our parochialness and our sense of definition of neighborhood and neighbor. Our dependence on security or our love of comfort. Our fears. This is the one that I love most, not surprising since I'm wearing a clerical garb, but our functional atheism. The belief that only by our power and not by God's will these things be done. That if we don't act, we're the only ones responsible. We have to let go of our shoulds and our oughts and our perfectionism. And another faculty professor in seminary say, don't should on people.
Oh, let me interrupt. Do you really think we should let go of our definition of a neighbor? Who is my neighbor?
That's a great question, Bob. I think it was meant in the best possible way. So holding this lightly, this is not the plan itself, but what got us to the plan. But I remember that comment. And it was the sense that sometimes we define neighbor in really tight, tiny circles. And we forget neighbor means others in our orbit, in our web of connections, and that we are going to need to remember our neighbors might mean people in Minneapolis, people in Wisconsin, people in Haiti, people in South Africa. That expanding understanding of neighbor opens us to the range of humans that are our neighbors, and that so often we define it too parochially and too tightly. So I get that we don't want to necessarily let go of an expansive definition of neighbor, but some of us are holding neighbor definitions that keep us from seeing the work that might need to be done. So this is not for all of us, but there are these things with us. And then because I figured out how to animate and then didn't figure out how to animate, there was one category that adds extra. So participants in the day one curricula that we did here in our Facing Our Fears series, participants generated 2 large lists of programs, ministry areas, recurring events, all of which seem vital and essential to us and to St. John's as a faith community, but which also seem important too to the wider community beyond our doors. And these included, and I'm not breaking these out into the categories, it's just good to know this is what was generated. So you'll see on the screen all of these areas that if you went to our website even, are categories of ministry at St. John's. But within them, we defined these things that might be needed. Vulnerable caring fellowship, excellent preaching, quality music, adult formation programs, racial reconciliation services, Project Home, First Nations Kitchen, our burgeoning and growing migrant ministry, special seasonal offerings like Advent, Lent, and others, not only liturgies, but learning as well. Big Wonder, our Owls ministry for the older, wiser laity among us, creation care, intergenerational activities, daily morning prayer, guest preachers, online ministry, LGBTQ+ welcome and inclusion, our farmers market, hunger relief, sacred Bible study and art, and many, many more were articulated in this space, and some held in the back of folks' minds as well. I'm sure you could think of things that you would add as our essential work for us and for the community. So, what are the emerging areas of focus out of that massive grab bag of things we've named? We will continue to, and lest this stray into an entire conversation about budgets, which we did have in this room, and which is important, and which we will continue to have, but we talked about supporting our existing commitments, which means that if we talk about focusing on emerging areas for 2025, we're not first talking about drawing back from commitments to do that. Our hope is that in our fundraising efforts and in our organizing and in our leadership in these existing programs, we might just reorient more of our work to focus on these focus areas. So, for instance, we've always done liturgy at St. John's. Only in the last few years have we done racial reconciliation, Holy Eucharist, which means we have created a small budget line item to underscore that. But we could do all of our liturgies as racial reconciliation if we wanted to, using the existing preachers that are at St. John's, and make every day focused on that. I'm not saying we will, but I'm saying that would require zero additional dollars, but it would take some intentional leadership internally to think about how to do that. So, what are the emerging areas of focus for 2025? There were 3 areas that folks in this room put stars on, and the 3 areas, I mean, there were 3 kind of point groups. So there were some that had this many points, and this many points, but they totaled 7 areas. So the highest level of support folks in the room here felt that was important for us moving forward was migrant support. So this new ministry we're doing, which requires new people and new resources, and is currently only proposed budget spend in the operating budget, which hasn't even been added fully in. It's just been proposed through committee, but which will be debated at vestry and either added in or not. But there are other streams that we might be able to use, say, for instance, reserve funds and other things, special fundraising, extra donations. But the work that we're already doing was seen as so important, it met the highest level. We may not be able to do more than what we're doing, but there was a strong desire to recognize that this is an area of people that left, right, and center in this campaign have been the political football kicked around. And there is every chance that following this election, this group, left, right, or center, is most likely to be deepest impacted after the election by policy. The next was our racial reconciliation and other guest preachers that show up at St. John's from time to time. The recognition that if we're working on justice, alternative voices in our pulpits is a big piece of what helps us hear the words of justice and feel them in a liturgy differently. Pastoral care, women's group, and children's formation and intergenerational activities. Those 3 were the next group that were felt to be most important to reflect our values and the emerging needs after the election. We can think about that pretty easily, right? Pastoral care, we're already recognizing this on November 3rd after the Foray Requiem, and then again on the 10th after the election. Members of our circle of care will be present along with any non-stipendiary and regular clergy at St. John's at stations around the church to offer prayers for those who might be anxious, hurting, afraid, or in any kind of need for pastoral care, because in times of anxiety, other needs often bubble to the surface and we don't even know they're there. And then we realize, oh, I've been struggling with depression and I need to talk to someone about that. So pastoral care will be urgent inside our community for sure, especially within our community, those groups like women, LGBTQ, and others who are hearing the rhetoric of their bodies being in the line of fire for certain parts of policy. That might raise even extra anxieties and require extra pastoral care from our whole faith community. Our women's group is another area that was named as of highest priority. Obviously, the issues of policy that attend to women's bodies were very clearly named, have been clearly named in this election process. And it is clear that there is still much for women to lose and there is much still to be gained that is needed for justice when it comes to women's rights and bodies in our society. And so we felt that group needed continued support and resources. Children's formation, intergenerational activities. Clearly, education has come up time and again in this election process. We know that it stands to be deeply impacted by the outcomes, but also our kids are probably the ones who are most unable to process and metabolize their own anxieties that they're picking up in the wider culture. There's going to be a lot of need to be present with our kids in the year ahead. We felt like the work that's happening through Big Wonder, this is the next group of priority. Big Wonder was a very vital partner for us. They're literally on the front lines of racial justice, gender justice, and sexuality justice in their teaching model. And they're virtually an unknown model of formation out there in the wider world. And so what we're doing here is both precious, but also vulnerable. It needs to be nurtured. And then hunger relief through First Nations Kitchen, Hallie P. Brown, and others. They're going to be, regardless, we've seen the way the economy has moved ahead for many, but left even more behind. The growing price of a grocery run means that people's food insecurity is honestly the first place that they feel the pinch economically. And so our work there is going to be more than needed. So all of those things being true, what will we do on day 1, 2025? Notice it's on the cornerstone, reminding us that we've been around for a lot longer than that. So what will we do? In the stewardship budget that came to you in your pledge ask this year, in the budgets that were discussed in this room, and in the budgets that were looked at Vestry, these were the areas that saw increases of support proposed. So if you were in that session, you probably already saw that Sarah Dole led us through looking at how the proposed budget, which is still yet to be fully funded, but is our proposed spending, proposes increases in these areas. So through Spiritual Life, additional money, particularly designated to retreat leaders, but can be used in other ways as well, is one increase. There was an increase in the area of guest preachers and racial reconciliation through our liturgy line item. There's increased spending in children, youth, and ministry that goes to a number of ways that will be supportive of that program. As I say, there is a proposal on the floor from Faith in Action to put some nominal budget in for migrant ministry to help it sustain in the year ahead. I'm committed that if it doesn't go through the operating budget, that we'll get creative to make sure that it has some funds. Through general justice work, so that's both Faith in Action and new advocacy initiatives. And staff salaries and benefits and hunger relief. You may wonder, why do staff salaries and benefits tie to any of the aforementioned categories? And if you saw in the ask, there's a moment where I say something briefly about that, but suffice to say, that in a world where it is becoming increasingly difficult to afford the basics, are increasing around particularly cost of living, never mind merit-based raises and other things, just the very basic to match inflation is really important from a justice standpoint and a fairness standpoint. That if we're talking about justice in the wider world and our staff members are struggling to make their grocery bills, well, then we don't have a leg to stand on with our justice initiatives. So justice starts at home. It starts in your house too, in the ways that you spend your dollars and the ways that you work in your daily jobs. We don't stop faith at the door. It goes with us. We also, and this was really clear from volunteer coordinators, many of which are you, from staff members, is that we not forget to name that it's not just about dollars. We could put a lot of money into these areas and then have very little capacity for parishioners to actually show up to be involved in them. And we're not really then doing what we say we want to do. We're not putting our bodies where our dollars and our words are. And that's important too. So we hope to increase volunteer engagement and participation in these essential areas. So if you haven't filled out your pledge form yet, there is a category there where you can pledge your hours. I hope you'll do that. So those are the big areas of increase. We'll talk about them in a moment, but there's one more slide in this fun grab bag of slides. We also commit to some really, they're less tangible. They're not able to put a dollar specifically on it, but there are some things that we're doing. Prayer. I just talked about the pastoral care that we'll be doing by prayer before and after the election. I'm hoping that we can encourage parishioners, and there will be a letter coming from the parish about election day, encouraging our parishioners to make use of the daily office of Compline. So morning prayer, Compline, and recurring evensongs, to be a part of a community at prayer publicly. But if you don't have a prayer life at home, let me encourage you, and that's where I will also encourage you to begin that prayer life, because an essential building block of resisting both the functional atheism we named as needing to be let go, but also of continuing to keep us tapped into the power source with which we will do this work, is through private and corporate prayer. That we stay in touch with the source of divine life in the world around us and really grounded in it. Somebody pointed out recently that the word radical is actually not about extremism, it's about rootedness. Remember that if we're going to get radical, like the world thinks radical, the only way we're going to do it is by being rooted. So get radical in your prayer life. Pastoral care. God only knows I've already talked a little bit about the pastoral care needed. I'm delighted at St. John's that our pastoral care capacity is as great as it's ever been. And it feels as insufficient as it has ever been, because as we build out the apparatus of pastoral care, which is people getting trained in the core practices of care and pastoring, the more our parishioners know they can come forward for those needs, the more there's a trust that the church is a place where we can come for care. So with capacity comes greater awareness of need. And so I have a sense that in a time of heightened anxiety and other real things that will happen in the world, that we're going to need to continue to bolster, particularly our pastoral care leaders in formation and discipleship. So spending time with them in their process of learning, so that we're equipped when those needs come toward us. I think those of you who are involved in pastoral care ministry know it's a big team. They're well formed, they're smart, they're faithful. And there's a lingering question over every session, which is how can I be more of use in the pastoral need of the church? Because I'm not sure where my authority begins and ends. And so there's this continued need to equip and cultivate that. We will expand our partnership with Big Wonder in the year ahead. There's a little more wiggle room in terms of real estate, which is our most accessible way of being in partnership, is to expand the footprint that they can use. We've also expanded it last year by raising scholarship funds for kids to be able to go there at a reduced price. We have found other ways to be in relationship and partnership with them. We're exploring those. That's an ongoing dialogue, and we will continue to deepen that over the year ahead. And then, again, echoing what I said about pastoral care, formation and discipleship, especially as it relates to racial justice work. For those of you who do any kind of justice work in your anywhere, either through the church or elsewhere, I'm sure, like me, you have found it oftentimes bewildering when you talk to someone who isn't able to connect the dots of their faith story with a need in the world, sometimes even through life at church, unable to connect justice and money, justice and staffing, justice and other things, justice, which is a prime tenet of the scriptures. It comes up again and again and again. So to get there, more of us need to be in discipleship. More of us need to be in formation around these issues. That's not even a volunteerism. That's a turning over hours of our lives into faithful listening and learning, and not assuming that when we come to these doors that we're being infantilized because we don't know as much as we'd like to know. It's admitting that we're all in a process of growth and learning, and that this is valuable time spent, whether it be in this room or whether it be through the Bible studies and other activities that this church does, or out in the wider world. So those are the basics of the plan. I can toggle back and forth between this slide and this slide, which include kind of the points of it, and it will be sent out to the parish. The reason we're presenting it today, and there are members of vestry here, it's so good to see you, vestry, who are listening as well, because at some point we'll be passing a balanced budget and also making leadership decisions throughout the year ahead that cue off of this plan. Again, I want to remind everyone in the room that this plan emerges from the dialogue of the forum series, the stewardship committee, listening and discerning, the listening process, and the budgeting process that Vestry engaged in. So it's a multiple threads, lots of your input is in here. But if I've already received some feedback that there are things that might be missing and that might need to be said, what are the things that we might need to add here so that we can fine tune this or dramatically readdress it that might be needed in the year ahead after our election? And what I'll do is I will take notes on my laptop like a dutiful student, because I am being formed as well. Things that you see missing.
I see kind of care of our community space, you know, this is really all about programs. Any of these things that are on the screen could happen anywhere, in a warehouse, you know. We can do them without being in this building, but if we want to be in this building, we also need to care for it.
Okay. Well, I'll steal from someone who emailed me, and maybe it'll jog others of you. One of the thoughts was around migrant ministry that this year in learning about how to do it has been eye-opening about the depths it requires of us to be present with one household. And what that one household, with all of the apparatus of legality and other programs that are available to those on a legal path to legal immigration path, provide. That if we go deeper in could mean more families. It could mean support for those who are undocumented. It could mean a number of different things, and that getting clear about that is probably important, because this is what we're already doing is a monumental task, it feels like, to those who are involved. And so somebody rightly reached out and said, obviously this is an overview of the plan, but we should be really mindful of that granular point. So that might jog some of you. What are other things that you might be thinking about?
Jared, just to add on that point, I think we expected to have more infrastructure support from the Council of Churches than was present. Now, maybe that can get better, maybe with feedback, but it's not necessarily such a solid partnership.
Right.
So we found ourselves having to figure out a lot of things.
Yes.
For ourselves.
And that's with a family who are documented.
Yes.
And you can imagine an undocumented family through the same organization, but with less recourse to the grants and federal dollars that are available for the support of migrants. It will become even more kind of a guesswork of how do we figure out how to provide blank, fill in the blank. We can't just go to this agency or that agency or just lobby the council for greater support.
Wasn't at the migrant support team meeting on Friday because I was traveling, but were you guys there, either of you? Yeah. It's really occurs to me that, because I'm on that support team and I've done, some of the tasks that are on this spreadsheet. But it seems to me that the lion's share of responsibilities falls to our staff.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, 100%. And it's not just, the lion's share goes to Sarah Dillon. I know she would agree to that. She wouldn't be humble about it. She would say, yeah, absolutely. But she does it gladly and joyfully. But the reason she would say really clearly is that if we're going to do this, we should be clear about where it's happening so that we can be so we can be supportive. The other lion's share falls to Chris Tegler, who has kind of come into the position of mentor, friend, confidant, translator. He's boning up on his Spanish every evening so that he can be better at it. Which is not to say that there have not been a whole group of lay people doing a lot. It's taken a lot of coordinating and effort to get us there. But you're not wrong, Betty. Anything beyond migrant ministry, thinking here of the other categories on the budget side, but also on this final page of ways that we can be more involved in response.
Go back to that. In that bottom line of formation and discipleship around racial justice. What's been done has not been very inclusive of both sides. And part of,
In which way?
well, that's what I want to say. I've talked with our associate rector, Craig, for several years about this, and our approach hasn't been one of really immersion with the other, in that to where you actually become partners, not just we can help you this way.
Right.
So it needs a whole new model than we have thought about in the past. So there's a lot of time and learning and development of what might work
Yeah.
in that.
Thank you for saying that. That is really clarifying. I will say, and because I spent a lot of time talking to the associate rector about this too, is that the assumption we bring as a predominantly white community into building our pathway into racial justice work is trying to do as little harm as possible, which means that we have to start with things like sermons and talking about racial justice internally in a predominantly white context, so that our awareness as we move, hopefully over time, into places where communities of color feel safe having us go immerse, that we're there in ways that are less damaging. We can never be perfect about this, but that's the assumption, is that we want to get there, Roger, like to the place of full immersion where we are in full relationship. And there are pockets of it at St. John's, but hence the focus on discipleship and formation. There's a fear that if we just plunge into, say, let's go join Holy Trinity in something that they want to do together and be with them over a season, which we tried, the kinds of things that might pop up in conversation might not be helpful to that relationship. So doing some internal work first. But it's
Chair,
yeah.
if I could add to Roger's point and underline that, there is new leadership at Valley Q Brown, and Jared and Patty Byrne Falls and I and maybe a couple of other people from St. John's were invited to a prayer breakfast that the new executive director held a couple months ago. And I would say there's real openness to anything, he's really wanting to strengthen relationships. And, I wonder if sometime we could have a forum over there.
Yeah.
Just do this and invite them to sit around the tables with us, because what we heard that morning, he's rebuilding from the bottom up, really.
Absolutely.
So I think the time is very good if we are interested in that Rondo neighborhood.
Yeah.
Of Valley.
Yeah. Another option that's coming up this year will be our relationship with Holy Trinity. We will be doing some holiday related stuff. So no helping our neighbor kind of stuff. It'll be being in relationship and worship through the common bonds of Anglican, spiritual life, but in a community that's predominantly of color. And so cultivating opportunities for us to do that, but we have to show up to that as like worthy of our time, where you're not being asked to serve, you're not being asked to teach, you're not being asked to provide some help to be in relationship.
Dumb question, where's Holy Trinity?
Honestly, I don't know the exact cross streets off the top of my head.
Neighborhood's fine, nearby.
It's one,
Near East Side.
one,
No, it's over by Hamlin
yeah,
University,
it's
on
like
the
one
west side.
block west.
Van Buren,
Shallon.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
really close to Faux Pasture.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I could add to this, building on Roger's suggestion, maybe we need to think about immigrant-led initiatives that we can support. as one way of addressing the opportunity for us, and I don't know if Holly Q is doing anything in the realm of immigrant support, but, maybe we can build some intentional partnerships, that would help with our dire need for volunteer support and volunteer leadership and support. And then a question is, we're lacking a deacon. So I don't know if we're budgeted for a deacon or, you know, that's such an important role.
Thanks for saying that. No, I have lobbied for a deacon. Deacons tend to not be a stipendiary role, which, as we learned, not just in our last, I think Margaret would corroborate this, that it's an incredibly large load that a church of our size in the scope of Faith in Action programs puts on an unpaid person. So the question of a deacon is needed. We do need a deacon liturgically and for their, ideally for their prophetic internal voice, but also that connection, that bridge between the world and us, and any leadership they can lend to the work, the practical nuts and bolts of Faith in Action. But we may need to be thinking about, and this is the hard part, is our budget is already stretched at the point of personnel particularly, but of how do we afford that kind of, what is, you know, if Sarah is de facto running a Faith in Action program as a staff member, we're already getting some of that salaried support, but to the detriment of other areas that Sarah was called and hired to do. Same with Chris, same with any of the rest of us. So yeah, there is a need for some thinking about sustainable support of our serving ministries. I think the other piece of that is the question of where our focus need lie. There has been a long tradition at St. John's that lobbied a predominantly what was perceived as a predominantly wealthy and therefore disconnected from the needs of the world community into deeper dollars and cents involvement. So over the last 20 years, the budget for Faith in Action, both off budget and then on budget, so pledged dollars and special fundraising, has increased by tens of thousands of dollars in response to that faithful lobbying to move us more deeply into the work of meeting the needs of the world. One of the things we did a decade ago with Keely Franca's leadership, then Keely Morgan's leadership at the time, was to take a look at dollars advocacy and dollars ministry as opposed to engagement with our lives. That we're not the United Way. We can't scale to the level of direct service that a nonprofit, and those of us involved with Holly Q. Brown know, not even a nonprofit that has its express purpose of being a nonprofit that meets people's needs can scale adequately to meet it. And so the question before us has always been the balance of like, should we draw back from a lot of direct service that often requires big dollars and lots of hours and into discipleship and advocacy that changes the structures around us, so like working on changing ourselves and advocating for change in the world. And I don't think it's an either or proposition, but this is the time where we might need to be thinking about what is a sustainable approach to justice. Is it just feeding a hungry person, or is it getting 100 of us involved in policy decisions that will help feed through programs thousands of people, because both require lots of time and engagement. So it's a worthy question for us.
Yeah, Dan. Two things. Concerning lay-led organizations, it would be interesting to see if there was a group leadership training or leadership training in how to run a dispersed. So the morning prayer group, we do it 8 o'clock. Juanita's the point person, but she isn't the whole thing. Everybody is working together. So it's a group leadership. Creation Care, after Johanna left, we divided up the leadership into at least 3 people, but we've included other individuals. And so it's more of a way of giving and this is lay-led structure where people who are enthused about something can
come in and become part of a leadership team as opposed to it just falling down to the one person. And, when they're not there, then it all falls apart.
Mhm.
I've seen that in other churches where, they have these great programs and they spend money on it, and then that person leaves the church and it just goes away. The second thing is, and Linda, you remember too, is in addition to Hallie Q Brown, the other half is Penumbra. And they are offering workshops in equity training. Now, the point being is that it's the creative energies, it's the people being creative and using their I just went to right now the History Theater is doing their raw stages, and I'm going and I'm seeing these wonderful works in progress by. So there's the original author, right? But they team up with a dramaturg, a director, and a whole bunch of actors, and then they work for 20 hours, and what they come up with is much different than as the author last night said. Well, I have this all in my head, but it is really nice to see other voices outside of my head. And so this creative energies and we have a fantastic music program for people who are really interested in the creative process. And I would think that St. John's should be able to find other ways of engaging people's creative energies. And like I said, Linda and I went last year to Penumbra, had specific events that they're not doing it this year, as far as I know. But they do this where they have, equity training, and they have specifically for white allies.
They are still doing that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay.
We've been to 3 so far, and there'll be another one in March coming up.
Oh, okay.
They're on their website.
Yeah. Yeah,
So, and they are fabulous, just like you said.
Mhm.
thanks for that. One more and then I've got
I
to
just-
close the.
I just was gonna say, Dan, we've seen that same kind of development of leadership in our Bible study with art. And also in fellowship, it used to be one fellowship chairperson had to plan everything. Now it's just a group of people. And we share ideas, share responsibilities for different events, and it works very well.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think we've seen really good progress at St. John's. And actually, as St. John's, excuse me, a frog in the throat. As St. John's was culturally functioning as a much smaller church for a long season, there are vestiges still of that kind of leadership where there were kind of coalesced groups of people to do shared ministry of some kind or another. And where there is a need for real detailed, like specific plans for a whole season, say, or in the case of like migrant ministry, like we need to know like who can be called, they need to be posted here, they need to be the person in charge when, and then when they're gone, someone needs to be that kind of hierarchical and point person. There are some ministries that require that, and the sussing out would be for vestry to think, where can we have a little more flexibility? Because something like morning prayer or like Bible study, that's a great like space where there can be shared energy across the board and not burn just one person out, or they leave and the whole thing collapses, which we have experienced on some of our less than essential programming, where someone leaves and it becomes a passion that walks out the door with them. To your point, Dan, about engaging people's creative energies, I don't know if any of you have noticed, but I certainly, from an inside perspective, I've noticed an increase at St. John's this year, unplanned. We don't know where, like, other than the Holy Spirit, like, I don't know why this is happening, but Chris Vincent-Haler raised up the idea of doing a play with our kids that spoke to social issues and was a meaningful way to engage in something leadership related and faith related through creative energies. Mary Johnson is offering something similar in I think February, is that right? Coming up around death and dying, a pastoral need that will be teaching, but using creative energies and art through the theater. Former parishioner Eva Gemlo brought her theater troupe here to address issues around women's bodies and birth. There are at any given time, actually on the night that Chris and her troupe were doing their show, there was a theater company in the gym rehearsing for a play that they're gonna do somewhere else. So arts seem to be coming towards us. On Wednesday of last week, the arts coordinator for the cathedral popped into my office and said, hey, I'm just in the neighborhood. We have art galleries that we do at St. Mark's, and we're wondering if you all have an art person here and if we could coordinate on art shows between our two communities. And I thought, wow, like it just keeps coming. So there is room for it, and you should always listen for when the energy is coming towards you, as opposed to thinking we should go out there and do something that no one is asking about, which is more often than not the way the church operates. I want to name one more thing that was raised to me that was missing, and if it's okay if I read, is that all right, Lynn? It's so well worded. But Lynn, being part of the formation team, went back to the source material in day one provided to us by our bishop, but also created by the Vandersal Collective, our consultants. And they write in there, on day one of the next administration and in whatever that follows, communities of faith must continue the work of being God's people, regardless of whether or not you see the outcome you desire. The work will need to go on. And then they write, you'll either be working in alignment with those you trust, or you'll be in resistance against those you do not trust. Either way, there will be work to do. I might nuance that to say there are probably going to be things about either party that you'll be working in alignment with, and more on one side that you might be working against, but either way, there will be things to resist and things that feel like they're in alignment. So what are our thoughts in this plan about organizing for the work of resistance? Plain and simple is the question. And I thought that was such an important question, Lynn. Thank you.
And also this morning, we prayed for our faith communities that they may not succumb to indifference or accept the status quo, but press on for fundamental change.
I appreciate you asking it, in part because this has been the biggest area of growth, I think, in terms of, that's why the discipleship piece is in there about racial justice. Is we have so often felt more comfortable with writing a check or showing up to fill a food ministry than speaking up and saying, my faith teaches me this is wrong. And that piece has been really, really challenging for us. It's not just a St. John's problem. I think it pervades lots of particularly upper middle class white institutions, that there's this fear of being pushy. Mary.
I spent a lot of time demonstrating against the production of nuclear arms in the early 80s. Now, 35, 40 years later, you're telling me I have to do this again. I'm so tired.
I know there's some humor, but there's a lot of truth in it. There's a lot of truth in that, Mary.
I
We'll
think
do it gladly.
one thing we could do, though, Jared, coming from you, is to tell the spiritual life groups, for instance, that this is one of their roles to bring forward to you and the parish where are the points of harm, where, depending on what starts coming out as policy, that we can really all be aware.
That's really helpful. It's interesting that we've had a robust engagement of LGBTQ persons for the last 10, 12 years here. But it took a staff person to really advocate internally to me about pronouns and what that meant for our particular trans and non-binary siblings. And then to start seeing how to lead for that. Because, you know, we've had any number of queer folk who didn't, so giving permission to say, like, if you hear something that needs to change both externally or internally, come to us. That's a great idea. Thank you, Lynn. Any last thoughts, and then we'll wrap up. Then just a point so that you know what's coming next. Next Sunday will be the final session of this, so we will incorporate your thoughts into this plan. I will share it again with the vestry, many of whom are here, but who by nodding and assenting, I'm assuming, are on board with what we're up to and have had a chance by email to push back or to add to. So thank you for that. And you can do that still in the week ahead. I will then send this to the parish along with a communication about the coming election. You may have noticed this season that the clergy have been a little bit quieter, particularly, I'll just be really honest here. well, we're being recorded, but I'll still be really honest. We've not said a lot about Donald Trump's rhetoric in this last election. In part because, one, it's apropos of Harris' point of like, how much can you say? And it feels like you just have to keep saying it. But two, there is a sense in which he gets so much bandwidth in the rest of the world that we just agreed that we weren't going to give it oxygen at St. John's and just keep talking about what we know we believe in. Like we're going to keep saying the other story as loudly as we can. Rest assured that like you, I have been deeply dismayed and disturbed about the prospect of a potential fascist president and about the harm that could happen to real bodies. And without both sidesing, I've said this already in other places, I know that the election of Kamala Harris will also promise some things that will be damaging to the lives of people we care about and that our faith teaches us to. So there is a real fear and then there's real work either way. And so I think we'll have our work cut out for us in the year ahead and following. We start with care for ourselves, care for each other, and then we step up big in the world. Thank you for being a part of this process. I know it's been exhausting. I know your news feeds drain you of all your political energy anyways, but thank you for showing up to this today. We'll bring it back next Sunday for everyone to have one final look at it before it goes out to the whole parish. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your leadership, each and every one of you.